O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
Now, for most of you guys are going to be familiar with my background in psychedelics. I got into Terence McKenna well over a decade ago during my undergraduate studies. It's when I first started dabbling into psychedelic substances. So for me, I think my first trip was with LSD. Then I started getting into psilocybin mushrooms and then eventually MDMA, rave culture. I've done ayahuasca ceremonies and then DMT. So in regards to the tryptamines, of which Terence McKenna is particularly an advocate of, I have a very familiar relationship with. I've done psychedelics quite a bit back in the day. I no longer do those, and I've discussed why I don't do that in previous streams, like the one I did on the Eleusinian Mysteries to Aleister Crowley. There was a section there, and I'll be uploading a clip video on why I eventually quit psychedelics, and it had to do with my own spiritual journeying, believing much of what McKenna promotes. So for me, my undergraduate, I sort of grew up in a naive conservative Methodist household. And when I got to college and got introduced to sort of academic or scholastic interpretations of the Bible, this sort of radically altered my worldview and my belief in many of the things that I was taught growing up. This led to me taking other courses on world religions and get really interested and enamored with Eastern mysticism. This led to a couple summers in southern China at Sun Yat-sen University, and then eventually going to my master's degree, still deeply invested into the psychedelics and looking into Hermeticism, Gnosticism, early Christianity, the Nag Hammadi scriptures, as well as psychedelic shamanism. They have a Dr. Treat, shout out to you, the Native American scholar over at the University of Illinois. He allowed me to focus on inebriating substances of such. And so that was what I focused much of my master's research on. And I, as you guys know, created an old YouTube channel which promoted a lot of psychedelics. So one thing that psychedelic people often like to criticize is that if you haven't done psychedelics, you can't criticize psychedelics. They would say it'd be like somebody who, and this actually comes from McKenna, it'd be like somebody who's a virgin describing what it means to have sex. They don't know what it's like. However, they can't levy that criticism at me because I have done all these substances. Now, as I highlighted in previous videos, I eventually, before I got into Orthodox Christianity, which is already a very rare and a minority form of Christianity, I was in Berkeley, California, and I had basically everything that I wanted. I had plenty of LSD. I participated in ayahuasca ceremonies, had DMT, psilocybin mushrooms. And by journeying deeper and deeper into these worlds through your heroic dose, 5 dried grams in silent darkness, eyes closed, did all these things. And eventually I came to a point where this couldn't be it. This couldn't be the whole religious mystery. This couldn't be the basis of all religions. This couldn't be, this something that's going to fulfill the rest of my life. It felt like a sort of dead end. I've again ventured into the DMT realms where you contact various entities. I myself never encountered what Terence McKenna will describe as the self-transforming machine elves. I did encounter humanoid-like entities, but I didn't have the experience that he often describes in regards to the sort of elf-like, gnome-like creatures that come out and know a lot about you, or jumping in and out of his chest and all this different stuff. But reviewing his ideas is somewhat quite nostalgic for me because I love these things. And I remember just preparing, you can see how many tabs I have open for clips that we're going to look at today and do a little bit of review of that. I very much enjoyed his ideas. It was a stepping stone in my life, if you will. Now looking back after over a decade and going on my own academic journey, finishing up my own doctorate research and finding myself in a totally different place than where I started. It's quite interesting. It's quite interesting. And that's why the review video today on highlighting why Terence McKenna was wrong, I think is sort of a full circle for me. And here's a few points and that we're going to be getting into, because not all of Terence McKenna's ideas I totally disagree with. There's a few that I'll highlight right now that I actually do agree with, even though my interpretation of them is going to be quite different than his. One being the archaic revival. One of the central tenets of his worldview was that Western civilization was undergoing a massive transition in which there's an archaic revival in which primitive activities like tattooing and sexual permissiveness and body modification, body piercings, rave culture, all these things were sort of sentiments and practices of our archaic past that were sort of coming through the forefront of Western civilization as it sort of came to its own endpoint, its own sort of cul-de-sac of ideas, if you will. And so he saw this as a positive thing. Much of the progressive culture that we see today, when we look at drag queen story hour, the promotion of transgenderism, of course, he was very much a supporter of sexual permissiveness, which includes various forms of homosexuality and sexual promiscuity, orgiastic activity, these types of things. We already see these. The sexualization of our culture is very much sort of this archaic revival, if you will, as opposed to the Christian sentiments that sort of relegated and put these things in a correct context for us in the proper context of marriage. Now, I know many people watching this video are going to be upset with my opinions, but that's okay. I am pretty straightforward and out front. I am an Orthodox Christian. I have done all these things. I've gone through my new age, my spiritual worldview, and now I'm at a different point. And here I want to highlight how I see it. So I do agree with him that the archaic revival is upon us, that these sort of pagan sentiments that lie dormant for so many years, or at least have been fought against by Christianity, both in the East and West, are now sort of central in our culture. However, I'm not for them like he is. He was absolutely for these. He saw these as a transgression of these boundaries, which is going to tie to something I've talked about before, which is the phallogocentrism, a central concept of Jacques Derrida, which wanted to undermine Christian civilization and said what we have to do is we have to undermine the phallogocentrism, the privileging of the masculine, the idea of logos theology or logos as this metaphysical construct, Jesus Christ, the incarnation of the Logos, which maintains these boundaries, and then centrism, the focusing on the center point. Derrida wanted to focus on the marginal and that we needed to invert everything. We needed to be anti-phallogocentric. And many of McKenna's ideas that we go through today are going to be exactly that. The dissolution of boundaries, then, is how he saw the archaic revival dissolving these phallogocentric boundaries, moving us towards what he saw, the transcendental object at the end of time. This is his teleology, his eschaton. For obviously Christians, we're going to believe in a sort of Antichrist phenomenon until the coming of Jesus Christ, and that we see the historical processes in a little bit of a different way. We're going to get into the transcendental object at the end of time here in a few and highlight how that isn't totally different than how Christianity understands Jesus Christ being the Omega, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. So he talked about how he believed history was being pulled from the future. This was his transcendental object at the end of time. And I have some clips where he's going to be discussing it as a sort of divine object. It is divinity. In a sort of secular language, this is his God. And that's going to be very different from Christianity in regards to God being an actual person, a personal relationship. And we see this all the time with various forms, especially with Eastern mysticism, where divinity becomes a sort of abstraction. It's a concept. It's a universal. It's not a person that you can interact with on a personal level. So I'll agree with the archaic revival, the dissolution of boundaries, and even in one of his lectures called Dreaming Awake at the End of Time, he talks about the balkanization of epistemology, meaning that there is no collective meta-narrative that we all are in agreement of anymore, that how we come to know something or in our worldviews are totally divided, totally divorced, that people believe all different sorts of things at this point, and there is no shared reality. He called this the balkanization of epistemology. I would also agree with him that this is absolutely the case. But even with his worldview and the promotion of the felt presence of direct experience, that would highlight a very subjectivistic understanding of how we come to knowledge, even though he highlights that he is a Platonist due to a la Alfred North Whitehead. So I agree with the balkanization of epistemology, and I agree that the power of language is related to magic and a sort of unique dimension of humanity. As an Orthodox Christian, we absolutely believe that magic is real. Now, magic is not the workings of God. It's about the manifestation of personal will due to the sort of interaction with other noetic entities, i.e. demons. Angels and demons in our worldview are noetic entities, and this is where we're going to have a totally different understanding of the imagination than that of Terence McKenna or much of the psychonauts who valorize and idealize the imagination, where we believe this is actually the battleground of much of our spiritual warfare. Now, the ideas that I'm going to disagree with are going to be his promotion of human depopulation. It's going to be interesting. I got a video that we're going to react to and look at where he talks about various conversations he's had with the mushroom. Interestingly enough, much of those conversations coincide with what I would argue is the new world order, the Great Reset, the globalist ideologies that we're going to promote a one world government, the dissolution of nationalism, the attack on traditional forms of masculinity, the attack on traditional forms of religion, or at least religions that claim an exclusivity to truth or transcendent reality. We see the promotion of ecumenism and all these different things. And the dissolution of boundaries towards a ultimate unification. Again, this is going to be central to Terence McKenna's worldview. And this is when I talked about the psychedelic spiritual paradigm or psychedelic mysticism. It's built upon this premise of ultimate unification, of which there are no more distinctions between things. And I highlighted that there's a term in Neoplatonism called henosis. And this is, in a way, a very subtle but distinct form of how we unify with God compared to Orthodox theology. And when I say Orthodox, I'm talking about Eastern Orthodoxy. For those, some people have mentioned that, what do you mean by all this Eastern Orthodox Christianity? The original form of Christianity for the first millennium is explicit on theosis. The idea that God incarnated was so that we can participate in divinity as created entities, and we can become gods by grace, if you will. That God's mercy in his incarnation allows us, through the inhypostatization of divine nature and human nature in a single person, to move into eternity. And so we have a totally different worldview then in regards to how we participate and align and become divinized than the psychedelic mystical worldviews, psychedelic spirituality, or anything like that. So one is that we're going to show a video that he advocates for women only having one children, especially Western, anybody in the West, anybody coming from European nations. We're also going to totally disagree with him on aliens and UFOs. He was a major supporter of the idea that mushrooms and what basically adopting Francis Crick's idea of panspermia and then associating this with mushroom spores, that the mushrooms that are on this planet are actually extraterrestrial entities. This is one of his ideas that he was very adamant about, even though it may seem far-fetched to us. He based this on the idea of the novelty and uniqueness of fungus, of mushrooms, generally speaking, as a living entity on this planet, and then tied this to the idea that, in fact, they're extraterrestrial entities due to the conversations he claims they have had under the aegis of psilocybin mushrooms. He wasn't a big fan of Amanita muscaria mushrooms. Again, muscimol, all this stuff. It's a bit of a different vibe than his particular favorite, which was Psilocybe cubensis, the basic sort of dung-growing mushroom that many people are going to be familiar with, shrooms. And so this is why he advocated the heroic dose, 5 dried grams in silent darkness. And due to these conversations, of which we have a whole video of him talking about what the mushrooms told him, we're going to be playing all this stuff. We're just going to lay out his whole worldview here in the beginning. And so he believed that the alien mushrooms were, in fact, extraterrestrials that were here to enlighten us. With some videos, he actually talks about that they are the missing piece of the human mind, and that these mushrooms were actually human flesh, of which we would totally disagree. He he believed, and we'll discuss this further here in a bit, but that psychedelics actually dissolve the what he called the male dominator ego in favor of a sort of more feminist understanding of humanity, and that this would then produce a sort of utopia. Now, he highlights Eisler's book, what is it? The Chalice and the Blade, which also sort of makes similar claims about the egalitarianism of more feministic societies in the ancient period. However, there's multiple examples of absolutely violent cultures that participated in ritualistic inebriation. You can look at in Norse culture, for example, the berserkers, noted for their psychedelic mushroom ingestion, typically done towards wartime, and that they would like to go into a state of frenzy and go into a state of blitzkrieg, of a sort of manic state in which they can become better warriors. They can dominate other people. You can look at the Aztecs. I just talked about this with Louis Unget in his book, where his book on the return of the dragon, highlighting various serpentine cults throughout history, the understanding of God being a serpent or a dragon, and how often it was related to the use of inebriating substances, human sacrifice, these types of things, which I think, again, we see consistent with his advocacy for human depopulation, his promotion of abortion, his promotion of sterile forms of sexuality. I think this would totally be consistent with, again, even Louis Unget's description and understanding of serpentine, dragon-like mythologies that worship these creatures. They tend to have similar practices. So machine elves, for example, he talked a lot about when you smoke DMT, you go into a state in which these small little creatures. And also I forgot to say there's multiple examples in the Amazon jungle itself too, which I'll highlight here in a few. Actually, we could do that. Well, I'll do that here in a few, but there's multiple examples of, well, let me pull that up. Actually, let's just do it right now. Right here. So this is addressing this text right here. This is from a book called War and the Noble Savage, which is addressing Terence McKenna's claim about psychedelics and their use, basically creating more egalitarian, nonviolent cultures, and highlights that's not even true within the Amazon itself. There's multiple ayahuasca cults within the Amazon that engage in ritualistic inebriation that are incredibly violent towards each other. And the author here highlights, so interestingly, in a near mirror image of McKenna's vintage, some have argued against the innatist biological theories of war by highlighting the extent to which people seem to require some sort of altered consciousness or intoxication in order to do battle. Among the Avatip of New Guinea, headhunting raids required special magic, which placed the fighters in a trance-like state of disassociation and relieved them of accountability for their actions. It was supposed to make them capable of killing even their own wives and children. This is to say, the ability to kill had to be imparted by magic and ritual, and deliberately remove the end of at the end of raids. The need for artificial induction at battle rage certainly upsets simple notions of hardwired violence, but in turn, for some people, they call into question McKenna's idea that psychedelics automatically chill out a supposed primate tendency towards aggression. One might point to the Amazonian people such as the Javaro and the Yanomami, noted for both violence and ritual use of McKenna's favorite tipples of ayahuasca brew, which contains DMT, closely related to psilocybin. These are tryptamine molecules. Whether Amazonian conflicts have been affected by colonization or not, the juxtaposition of tryptamines and dominator violence apparently suggests that the former don't automatically suppress the latter. I've never heard McKenna address this point, but I imagine he would have drawn attention to the second crucial component of ayahuasca, a vine which contains harmala alkaloids, such as harmine. Noted pharmacologist Alexander Shulgin cites reports of harmine experiences in which sensations of lightness alternated with instances of irrational aggression, One report said, the excitement I felt was increased even in a belligerent way. Although it was not my nature, I started to fight with a man in the street. However, harming synergy with other ingredients of ayahuasca appears to at least transform this potential. Ayahuasca's humbling visionary effects in its traditional ceremonial context seem to leave most of its association with conflict firmly embedded in specific and complex Amazonian cultural situations. So there's that. Again, we have evidence that certainly the utopian idea that if we just all took mushrooms, that we would be able to live more egalitarianly and peaceful. Multiple historical examples and also present day examples would refute that point. Another one, like I was getting into, that I would disagree with him is that these transforming machine elves are somehow benevolent entities that are leading us to higher and higher states. You can, for your own, we're not going to get in this in this stream, but you can go look up your own YouTube videos on people that have used psychedelics and specifically DMT, got into these altered states and encountered these self-transforming machine elves, these gnomes, these small little creatures that are actually what they appeared to them as demons. And I do believe that you encounter entities through psychedelics. We talked about this with Louis Ungen. I've talked about this before. My belief as an Orthodox Christian is that it has to do with the noetic realm, that angels and demons are understood theologically as noetic creatures. They are will and you can say mind, if you will, but the nous and what we mean by noetic faculty, a little bit more nuanced, but you could say that it's like it's about a will and mind is what a noetic entity is. This is angels and demons. Demons are those angels that turned against God inside of eternity and therefore can't turn back. Change necessitates time, all this different stuff. But how you would come to know if an entity is benevolent or bad or not, this would be a question that you could levy at people. How would you know if a self-transforming machine elf was good or bad? And based on what objective morality? This is going to be one of my criticisms when we look at his paradigm. Every paradigm, by the way, is formed by a epistemology, a metaphysics, and an ethics or a morality. And so we're going to highlight his epistemology, his metaphysics, but his ethics, it's going to be based on the transgression of that phallogocentric worldview. So his ethics isn't really coherent because it's really based on the premise of transgressing boundaries. That's why he was in favor of many things. Now, I'm not saying he was in favor of killing anybody or doing anything like that. Of course not. These are assumed, but how would one prove objective morality or something be objectively good or objectively bad? This would be a philosophical question to levy at him. Fortunately, he's not here to have a conversation. I'd love to have a conversation with him on many of these ideas. But the self-transforming machine elves, you can find trip reports on YouTube of all these people highlighting that they, in fact, smoked DMT, whether they got 3, 4, 5 puffs in before they were able to blast off, that they encountered these entities and they weren't necessarily benevolent creatures. Some were purely demonic. Some knew a lot about you. But I would say the interesting thing is so many of the messages that come back from these realms are consistent, generally speaking, with the progressive paradigm and the globalist. Again, if you are a conspiracy theorist, the globalist intentions due to the Great Reset. You can read Dr. Klaus Schwab. You can look at the New World Order, all this different stuff. But the idea that we're going to eradicate national boundaries, we're going to feminize men, we're going to move towards a one world government, we're going to pacify people with technology, seems to be certainly be the case. And I'd be interested to know how many people that are what I self-identify as psychonauts that got the jibby jab. You know, obviously within the United States, there's been some studies, and Christians, generally speaking, were the least jabbed group of people. And it has to do with how much faith do you have in the system. I highlighted in a previous stream that I don't see psychedelic spirituality or mysticism in any way being countercultural in 2023. In 1963, 1964, Summer of Love, 1967, and Haight-Ashbury, Woodstock, 1969. Absolutely, the psychedelic culture was countercultural. It was totally in opposition to the Protestant hegemony of America. But that's not in existence anymore. in 2023. Yes, the majority of Christians would identify as or most Americans would probably identify as Christian. But when you look at Cardi B, you look at the culture, you look at the commercials, you look at the forms of entertainment in this country, it's hard to say that this country is Christian in any way. And therefore, the promotion of transgressive or sexually permissive forms, and the utilization of drugs for personal gratification or spiritual enlightenment is of the dominant culture. So I think I actually just posted a video on my old YouTube channel of why I think psychedelic spirituality is on the rise, because it's actually part of the culture. And it gives people the feeling that I can dye my hair purple, I can get a nose piercing, and I can be fighting against the man. But really all you're doing is going along with the narrative and the agenda at will. Another point in which I disagree with him on is the belief so one of his ideas had to do with novelty theory. This has to do with another conversation he had with the mushroom, in which he began to utilize the I Ching. Those who are familiar with Chinese Taoism are going to be familiar with the divinizing, or it's a book of divinization. Actually, we're missing the other half of the book. This was part of the premise of his relationship with the mushroom here, is that Terence McKenna was told by the mushroom, again, there's half of the I Ching is missing, that the mushroom provided the information of this lost book so that then he could create and map time itself, which he considered the movement of novelty, the movement of complexity. And so he, obviously adopting that Hegelian, Whiteheadian process philosophy, believed that the world was becoming more and more and more complex, and that it was progressing and progressing forward toward a more ideal place. This is why he was an advocate for the dissolution of boundaries, because for Terence McKenna, the more boundaries that were dissolved, male, female, man, animal, man, machine, this only brought what he called the transcendental argument, the transcendental object at the end of time closer into our time frame. And so he believed, based on his mapping of time due to his relationship with the mushroom, that the year was going to be 2012. Now, his own calculations was November 2012, but eventually he changed it over to December 2012, which was the same date theorized by people who did calculations based on the Mayan calendar. Obviously, we are living in 2023. The idea that time machines, this is one of his ideas, that 2012 is going to be the time when time machines come back, and that was going to be the end of history, that, we were going to be able to transition between different time frames in the future. Didn't happen. Again, let me know, guys, if you guys saw a time machine come into place here in 2012. I didn't witness any. And certainly the end of the world didn't occur. This was obviously a very popular idea, but this would be one where, again, I disagree with him. And I do agree with him that there is going to be a sort of what he called, using Whiteheadian philosophy, a concrescence. There's going to be an endpoint. There's going to be, for T.L. Desjardins, an omega point. Now, again, I reject Desjardins because his whole worldview was consistent with sort of ecumenism. He falsified many bones. Look into Pierre's history. He lied about trying to prove human evolution and all these different things. Evolution is going to be central, again, in regards to mapping Terence McKenna's worldview. So obviously disagreed with his 2012, which obviously is already disproven. That's not taking a lot of intellectual courage there. But his technological singularity, see, he believed that this 2012 point was going to be part of this exponential growth and technological advancement that was going to lead to the ability to upload consciousness. He, before he had his brain tumor, theorized that he was going to be able to upload himself into a computer. And that wasn't quite the reality, unfortunately for him, and Lord have mercy on his soul. He had a brain tumor and died, I believe, in April of 2000. So he didn't make it into the 21st century too long. But the technological singularity, this has to do with a lot with my academic research in regards to transhumanism. And I'm very skeptical of the claim that we're going to be able to have a technological singularity where you will be able to sort of be disembodied, because part of the questions and the premises of the technological singularity is, what exactly is man? What is your anthropology? me as a Christian, I obviously believe that we have a soul. The people who promote the idea of a singularity do not believe you have a soul, because what you are is just the amalgamation of all your neurons and firings and the collectivity of your own memories. Therefore, if they can map the brain and the mind as an emergent property, that's what they believe the mind to be, an emergent property. I do not. I believe the mind is part of us being made in the image of God. Again, totally different anthropology. But they don't believe you have a soul. You really are just this emergent property of your brain firings. Therefore, they can map your brain and they can upload you in a digital form. I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe, one, you could even do that, because we aren't just a mind. We aren't just an emergent property. There's something deeper to what man is. It has to do questions of anthropology here. And so I totally disregard his anthropology, of which I'll highlight later. Is basically, his anthropology is really just matter through the Big Bang. He adopts basically the he's against dogmas, but he's in favor of some of the scientific dogmas of his day. So he adopts the Big Bang, and then for lack of a better word, macroevolution. And therefore, the emergent property of mind has to do with this, again, this process of novelty, and that we are just a random mutation for the pursuit of further and further novelty by the universe. I reject that. I firmly reject it based on, as I said, on anthropology. I don't think the technology can do that. And I think really the belief in technological singularity is less about the transcendence of mankind. Anybody who's read some of the transhumanist works probably going to be familiar with people like Max Moore and Natasha Vita-Moore, his wife, some of the leading philosophers and scholars in this realm, that Nick Bostrom being another, that I believe that what we're doing with our technology is recreating the noetic realm. And it would be a point of agreement, whether it be Robert Anton Wilson, Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna, that they talked about computers. In the last lecture Terence McKenna did, well, it was like something about in the age of intelligent machines. Forgive me, I don't remember the name of the lecture, but this was one of his last lectures before he passed away, that he believed that computers were essentially another form of psychedelics, not in the same degree, not in the same radicalness of the phenomenological experience, but that they began to dissolve boundaries, and that the internet and computers, generally speaking, were going to perform the same or have the same cultural effects that mass taking of psychedelics would have. Timothy Leary talked about this too back in the 1980s and into the 1990s. He died in the latter half of the 90s, where he theorized that the computer was the new drug. The computer was the new psychedelic. Same with Robert Anton Wilson. And so my point being that they have highlighted and they believe that these digital technologies were going to lead us to further transcendence. What I believe they're doing, and this is where I agree with them, is that what the psychedelics do and what the digital technologies that we're seeing in our culture doing now is it's creating a new noetic realm. As I said, angels and demons are, as an Orthodox Christians, we communicate with them through the imagination. This is why psychedelics, I absolutely believe you can contact entities. I have experienced entities on psychedelics in my life. What are they? Well, that's a question that we can get into further here later. But my point being is that they are noetic entities. And what we're doing with the technology, and this is something that I've had a conversation with Father Deacon Dr. Ananias about, is that all these digital technologies are also creating a new noetic ecosystem. And so I believe it's less about us transcending and more about noetic entities being embodied through the technology. So that'd be another point of contention with me and Terence McKenna. Another one is his opposition to all forms of monotheism. So looking things up, he's certainly not in favor of Christianity. He grew up Catholic. I believe Terence McKenna was Irish. He grew up in a small mining town in Colorado, and according to him, had a very conservative father, which I think he loved his parents. From all the years that I was listening to him, I certainly remember him and Dennis being closer to their mother, but he was sort of traumatized by the Catholic Church and was very antagonistic towards Christianity and adopted more of a Gnostic understanding. Well, I've done multiple streams on Gnosticism and highlighted that within the Gnostic paradigm, they also lack any sort of objective morality or any sort. So they then perform various feats for the ingratiation and the acquisition of gnosis, spiritual knowledge. Gnosis just being the Greek word for knowledge. So you can look at the Borborites, where they eat fecal matter, period blood, accused of even having ritualistic abortions. You can look at the Carpocratians, where they have ritualistic forms of sex, both hetero and homo, where they perform wife swapping, these types of things. Now, there's a lot of different Gnostic groups. This is a misnomer when we talk about Gnosticism as a sort of general thing for a single movement. It's not. Gnosticism, and I'm going to be doing an Orthodox deconstruction on the Gospel of Thomas here, potentially this week or next, where I'm going to highlight Gnosticism is characterized by a few attributes. One, by the what's called the Marcion heresy. It's the rejection of the Old Testament as being continuous with the God of the New Testament. They believe those are two separate deities, and that the God of the Old Testament is actually the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, Beelzebub, and that the world that we live in then is actually a prison. This is a characteristic of Gnostic theology. And Gnosticism then is an amalgamation of Platonism, of the mystery religions, such as Eleusis, such as the mystery traditions in Egypt, such as the mystery traditions in Rome, like Mithraism, all that type of stuff. It's the amalgamation of Platonism, mystery religions, and then Christianity. But none of the Gnostic Gospels, the earliest Gnostic Gospel is the Gospel of Thomas, and it's still 2nd century. So none of the Gnostic Gospels are apostolic in any way. But Terence McKenna certainly adopted a Gnostic understanding, and he was a major proponent of Gnosticism as an interpretation of Christianity. This would be another point of departure. I having bought into a lot of this stuff, and like I said, my master's degree at the University of Illinois was very much focused on Hermeticism and that Renaissance revival of it through Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pica della Mirandola into the magical age of the 16th century, where we get John Dee, Michael Meyer, Edward Kelly, all this different stuff. I'm very familiar. I was fascinated with that. But he highlights that Gnosticism is the continuation of the psychedelic paradigm that Terence McKenna is promoting, and I would absolutely agree with him there. But I disagree with the promotion of Gnosticism. I disagree with the promotion of the idea that apotheosis, that we divinize ourselves. One of the characteristics between Orthodox Christianity and then all these mystery traditions is, as I said, these mystery traditions are about man becoming God, where our tradition as an Orthodox Christian is about God becoming a man. And where you stand on that as central importance is going to differentiate which paradigm you ultimately adopt. So I reject his opposition to Christianity and promotion of Gnosticism. I also reject his stone ape theory. I myself don't promote or believe in macroevolution. I think there's a lot of holes. We can get into those here in a few. Some being the sort of logical fallacies of macroevolution. For example, the inability to, one, prove the connection between species. That's a big one. The other one is, for example, the survival of the fittest. This is just a logical problem within the Darwin's theory, is that if we are being selected based on the survival of the fittest, how would it, for example, like the first bat, a mammal? Well, the first mammal certainly wasn't a bat and didn't have wings. How would it be logically that a mammal would begin to develop an appendage such as a wing and still be the fittest for its environment? It makes more sense that what he would be doing by developing an attribute, he would become less and less fit. And if he's becoming less and less fit, then he would die generation after generation after generation. He wouldn't be able to grow further and further. I mean, how many generations does it take to grow a wing? How many generations does it take to create a totally different eyeball? And those stages in between are part of the logic fallacy that you can then criticize Darwinian theory, is that it doesn't make sense. They would be eaten. They would be extinct. They would have been killed. Again, there's other points. You can look at, the Hoover Institute has a really good example of criticisms regarding Darwin's theory by two atheists. It's not religious people. And then the other one is certainly a creationist, or intelligent design, at least. It's Stephen Meyer. He was just on the Joe Rogan Experience. So he's a Christian who believes in intelligent design, but I believe he believes in microevolution, not macroevolution, the descent from a single entity or species or a bacteria that was hit in a pond by lightning, of something like the primordial soup theory. He rejects all that, which I do too. when it comes to microevolution, when it comes to what's called speciation, the idea that there's multiple species of sharks. Clearly, the tiger shark is different from the great white, which is different from the hammerhead, which is different from the lemon shark, all of which have different phenotypes that have been adapted to the ecosystem in which they hunt and they live in. I agree with that. I absolutely believe in phenotype expressions that are altered based on the environments that you live in, but I disagree that the first shark came from some other entity, and science hasn't been able to prove this. So the stoned ape theory for McKenna is the belief that humanity, being arboreal apes, primates, were moving out into the grasslands of Africa due to drought. And as we moved out into the grasslands due to drought, the canopies that we were then swinging around in were drying up, that we encountered various ungulate animals. Ungulates just means hooved animals. And these ungulate animals left dung out in Africa, and what arose was the psilocybin mushroom. He argued, and his brother Dennis McKenna, and it's really a misnomer to call it a theory. It's a hypothesis. A theory is something that sort of has more scientific backing and provability to it. These are hypotheses. It's a misnomer to call it a theory, but the stoned ape hypothesis claims that then these arboreal primates began to eat and ingest psilocybin mushrooms, and at lower and then medium and then higher rates, they had different attributes. That at the lowest rate, he claimed that it added visual acuity. This has been criticized by the scientific community because there is no evidence, even though he uses one, I forget what the gentleman's name is, who ran the experiment. This is in the early 1960s, where they had people take very, very subtle amounts of psilocybin and then ask them to note when two lines began to no longer be parallel. Well, he used this study to cite that psilocybin added visual acuity, which then would have made the arboreal primates able to hunt better. Then he claimed that at higher doses, it causes sort of an erotic stimulant to the central nervous system. So therefore, these arboreal primates had hard-ons. Therefore, they would have been more sexually promiscuous, and fecundity would increase, but amongst the tribe, if you will. And then at higher rates, it would have been a full-blown mysticism that these primates would have had due to the ingestion of psilocybin. And he and his brother claimed this is part of the rapid development of what they call the neofrontal cortex. Now, I do not agree that this is how the neofrontal cortex came about, because I do believe that God created the planet. I believe in creationism, and explaining why I believe that that'd be another stream we can certainly do in the future. But continuing on here with McKenna's worldview, that's why I would disagree with his stoned ape hypothesis, often referred to as a theory. Also, I would disagree with his novelty theory in regards to complexity. Now, this is, I would say, actually the strongest argument he has, because it's basically just adopting the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, which is a serious scholar, by the way. Now, Alfred North Whitehead would reject the sort of transgression of boundaries thing that then McKenna adds onto this worldview through the ingestion of psychedelics, tattooing, body modification, sexual permissiveness, all this different stuff. Alfred North Whitehead would not promote that, but Alfred North Whitehead, famous for his relationship with Bertrand Russell and their mathematic logical positivism, their mathematic works. Later, he got into more a focus on philosophy, theology, logos, which McKenna also talks about. We'll discuss his theory of logos here when we get into metaphysics, but he basically just adopts the worldview of Alfred North Whitehead and then adds shamanism and psychedelics to it to present his sort of novelty theory. He uses, again, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin in regards to the omega point being his sort of transcendental object at the end of time, all these different things. So I reject his novelty theory, and I certainly reject his time wave zero, which, again, it's already been disproved itself. I don't need to come on here and rant about time wave zero. It just hasn't matched up and been accurate, obviously, because time wave zero was his basis for the idea that time was going to end in 2012, which didn't occur unless we're somehow no longer in time, which let me know if that's the case, because I've been highly mistaken. So I already reject this time wave zero, which is, again, time wave zero is his theory in which he is tied to novelty theory. It's tied to this I Ching, right? Remember when I talked about the technological singularity in 2012, his conversation with the mushroom led Terence McKenna to speculate using, again, creating a whole graph of time using the I Ching, which I don't discount that he's talking to a real entity. For me, as an Orthodox Christian, I believe it's a demonic entity, which then always inflates our own egos and our understandings of ourselves and our ability to grasp something that's actually outside of our capabilities, which is exactly what I think it does. Because it, in a way, when we engage with demons, they humiliate us in the long run. And certainly his 2012 speculation and his time wave zero theory, which he thought he was going to be viewed as like a mathematician after his life, which has been, sort of mocked and derided by actual mathematicians. But it's based on his conversations with the mushroom, and the mushroom highlighting the aspects of the I Ching that we don't have that second book, and therefore mapping time itself, mapping the ebb and flow of novelty, the ebb and flow of complexity, arguing, okay, boom, big bang, and then creation is becoming more and more and more and more and more complex. And as it becomes more complex, again, this is then the movement of history itself, leading towards what he argued, the transcendental object at the end of time, which was 2012. So I don't need to rant and rave around the time wave zero. It's already been disproven, but this would be another point. Another one would be the Gaia hypothesis. The Gaia hypothesis is built upon a premise of sort of emergent properties and the idea that the mind is an emergent property, which I reject as a Christian, because I believe the mind is actually part of us being made in the image of God. So the mind isn't something that emerges like wetness, right? This was a common metaphor he would use, is that, when you have one molecule of water, H2O, it's not wet. Wetness is an emergent property of multiple molecules of water. And this has been dealt with in regards to understanding what's called in the philosophy of mind the hard problem. That is, what is consciousness? What is the mind? And for many people, they have believed that the mind is actually an emergent property. So when you talk to a sort of materialistic atheist or somebody like that, they would argue that the mind isn't actually a real thing in and of itself. The imagination isn't a real place, or, again, this noetic realm, as I would argue. They would say it's just an emergent property of the functioning and firing of neurons in your brain. And so because of the interconnectivity and the multiplicity of neurons in your brain, what emerges from this electrical firing is the concept of a mind. Well, this idea, which is obviously rooted in evolutionary Darwinian Wallace theory, is also the premise of what would be like James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis. I do not believe that Gaia, or this divinized goddess understanding of planet Earth, is participating in things like logic and love and language, mathematics, reason, compassion, mercy, and all this different stuff. Is it living? Absolutely. Nature is living. But I believe, as a Christian, that only mankind, men and women, are made in the image of God, and therefore we participate in these higher faculties that animals do not participate in. Animals are not participating in mathematics. Animals are not participating in language. Yes, they communicate. They're not participating in language. Language is something different. So these higher faculties, mercy, compassion, reason, glory, honor, these, what are in Orthodoxy we call uncreated energies of God, that these are energetic realities that are natural to the essence, to the nature, to the substance of the Godhead. These are what make us unique in regards to the created world. Only Homo sapiens, and this includes the people who believe in aliens, which I reject. This is another point in opposition to his worldview. I do not believe in extraterrestrials. I do not believe in aliens. I believe that this is totally a psyop, again, by our own governments. I can get into that in a second. But the idea of these that animals would participate in these higher realities, or that planets and the planet, and the sun and Gaia, I reject all that stuff. I believe men and women are uniquely made in the image of God and can uniquely participate in these higher faculties on earth. And that includes people who speculate about these sort of salvific aliens that are going to come save us from our own nuclear destruction. I don't believe in any of that. I also reject his psychedelic apotheosis, that he believes that that through the ingestion of psychedelics and a sort of reflection on these felt presence of direct experience, that we will then move into our own divinity. I reject that entirely. And again, I believe in theosis, that the more we try to become more like Jesus Christ, who I firmly believe to be the Logos incarnate, it is God incarnate as a man, that is how we participate in divinity. That is the map of reality. That is the way forward. This is a totally different understanding, and this differentiates again when we come to objective morality and ethics, which he's not going to have one. So I also reject his psychedelic apotheosis, and I also reject his belief in extraterrestrial and aliens. So those are the few things that I agree with. Archaic revival, although we totally disagree with the interpretation of it. I agree with psychedelics being the dissolution of boundary and this being a phenomenon that's happening in culture. We totally disagree in promoting it. I do believe in the balkanization of epistemology as he described. And then I do believe in the power of language and magic, which is essential to Christian theology in regards to how we understand what the word is, what the logos is, who Jesus Christ, the incarnation of God's word, is, and what the relationship of language is to us and God and to this then the world, and how we can then communicate with these noetic entities, demons, angels, through words, a la John Dee and Edward Kelly and some of the Enochian magic and all that different stuff, which again, I totally am not in favor of. I believe that to all be demonic. So those are a few things where I disagree and agree with Terence McKenna.